Would somebody please back there shut the doors to begin? That would be great. There are maybe a few more people, but we can get started. I've had these late night musings, so you're going to get a couple of minutes. Dr. Kerr said, we've got lots of time. So I have had an appreciation the last couple of times I've been to Symposium, and this one especially, about this amazing, I don't know what I call it, this amazing mix that allows people to bring forth the very best that they can do and keep doing it, keep working on it, and present in this setting where each one contributes something unique. And I don't know about other scientific meetings, but to me there is no competition in this. It is an amazing sense of how each one contributes to the whole. And I had this fun thing, I don't know if any of you saw 60 Minutes last week, and Wynton Marsalis was featured in Lincoln Center, Cuba, and I got to hear jazz in a way that I started to appreciate it more and more. And I thought about that unique thing that people bringing their very best, and he's one, and the people that he works with that are his musicians, and how each one contributes something absolutely of their best talent. And it doesn't get lost when they put it together. It makes something even greater. And I thought about that from this meeting, from the last symposium at Bowen Center, that this is something that I think is very special, that ability for people to bring their best. And if you've got a taste of it yesterday, today, I think it's a great opportunity. So that was my late night musings. But we do have some, I think, let me see, a little bit of business to take care of before Dr. Kerr gets to take on another great morning. There's those of you who have CEUs, one CEU, they're at the registration table. So you have an evaluation in your packet, which would be important to fill out and then pick up your CEUs. And as Ms. Harrison said, sign those if you will, if you have the courage to sign them. But please do, it's part of the CEU arrangement and requirement that those things go in, and you'll get your CEUs and pick them up there. There's something else that I think I didn't know about yesterday anyway, that there are three of the current, I think relatively current, of the Family Systems Journal that would be available for purchase if you want to talk to our wonderful helper who's doing that. Yes?
It's Family Systems for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The three most current.
The three most current issues of Family Systems Forum. And they feature some of the presenters here, too. So you get a taste of what that can be. And you know a little bit about, and Katie Hall's been the editor, and it has been an ongoing, really valuable production of the CSNSF. So it's there for you to pick up and purchase individual issues and subscribe if you like. So let me see if there's any other housekeeping. Oh, we'll give you enough. People have been asking about the postgraduate training at the Bowen Center. And this time there are no brochures, but this is the website. And there's lots of information about it. And it would be important for you to be able to find it. So there it is. So, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say checkout is a new. People don't know.
Okay, we have talked to people about checkout, and they are not expecting a group in, and they are not anxious about us checking out at noon. So that was a relief for people, I'm sure. I had one other thought with Dr. Kerr yesterday. It didn't come out in our little fun thing that we had at the gathering. But I wanted to mention one of the things that has been so useful to me over these many years. I keep learning, and I keep learning from Dr. Kerr and his continuing learning. That has been one of the most one of the things that has impressed me so much is that he's not satisfied. He's going to keep on working and working at new ideas, but ideas that he can connect, science that he can connect. And so I think about this student, lifelong learning, who becomes a teacher. That is lifelong learning for the rest of us. And I really appreciate it. So we have another day, and I think that's a great opportunity. Thanks, then. Are you using it?
Thank you very much. Appreciate the comment about lifelong. I know I always thought Murray Bowen, at least when I met him, began to get to know him a little bit, that was, I guess he was in his late 50s. And then he lived 20 years. Died at 77, but he never lost interest in ideas and continuing to try to learn. I think it was less than, I don't know, 4 or 5 months before he died. I got a phone call late one night, must have been close to midnight. And his voice was hoarse in those days. He says, Mike, can you come over? Can you come over? We didn't live that far apart. So I thought, oh my God, is he dying or something? This was his way. He would take a nap in the evening and he'd be bright. And so I get over there and he says, Mike, I got a new idea. A project with the homeless. And then he began to outline how do we relate to the homeless in a differentiated way. Contribute. So right to the end, and anybody who saw the tape, he made AAMFT 2 days before he died. Still very much alive, even though he required constant oxygen by that point. And went home and died 2 days later with his boots on. So we have lots of time this morning, and what I envisioned, because my presentation is actually shorter than yesterday, it includes an introduction to a videotape, and then the edited videotape. So here's the, I guess we could have those lights down, and actually with the video maybe all the way down, give a little richer color. I don't know who's dealing with the lights. Okay. I think with the video, you'll appreciate the color. I don't know what controls these, but I guess.
Yeah. That's good because we can't type it. They're all on.
Well, you won't have much to write in this. Yeah, that's good. Just turn it down. Good, thanks. That's perfect. So, and then in the second part, we'll have probably at least 45 minutes for discussion. And sometimes that works extremely well. There's lots of time to expand on answers, expand on questions, etc. So, if this was a journal article, I would have shortened the title. They probably wouldn't accept that title. But I thought I would just write just what's in the tape. I see it. Observing the reciprocal interaction between relationship processes and the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals, and using that knowledge to manage oneself in relationships. As you see in the left here, it's excerpts from an interview with Barbara Maher, who has her Bachelor of Science in Nursing, for the Bowen Center Clinical Conference, April 17, 2009, doing the interview. And this came off Amazon. The Man Who Listens to Horses. Monty Roberts. I would think people in Texas may be more familiar than most with the work of and ideas of Monty Roberts. But I put it there on this opening slide because in the interview, she spends about 4 minutes at the beginning reading 2 pages, I think, out of Robert's book to set the stage for what she's going to talk about in her marriage. Barbara McMaher is a person I've known for, 25 years, I guess. She got into Bowen theory in the mid-1980s. She had quite a few problems playing out in her life, lots of anxieties, lots of marital difficulties, some other issues, and then found her way to the Bowen Center, I think by the late 80s, and I wound up coaching her off and on over the next 20 or so years. Roughly on a monthly basis later on, which is not unusual for people who do this coaching effort long term. But also some big gaps in when I saw her, several year gaps sometimes. So I approached this interview. It's called the Clinical Conference. It was started in 1967, fall of 1967. Dr. Bowen started this conference in Richmond, Virginia, at the medical school, Medical College of Virginia, which had a first-rate television studio. And he would interview families first thing in the morning, and people would watch, an audience would watch closed circuit in another room. And then he would come back and have a discussion with the audience about the interviews that he did that morning. Very effective conference, and eventually the families that were interviewed were included in the discussion period, which required managing the audience in ways that maybe we can talk about a little bit later, because people can get reactive to what they see on tape and then flood a room with that reactivity, and the family's kind of anxious. But he got through that, and to my knowledge, it's a unique conference. Nowhere else in the world, literally, does such a conference exist. The patient may come in and be interviewed, and then the patient leaves while the therapist discusses the patient. But here you have the person who was interviewed, present to participate and listen to what's said about them. I think it really does break down the barrier between expert and patient, and keep the emphasis on how much alike all people and all families are, differing only in degree, not kind. This particular interview, I really approached it as she is an expert in her own right. She's done a lot of studying of Bowen theory. We've had a community seminar over the years where people can take Bowen theory as a course, and she participated in that for a long time. And really is quite knowledgeable about Bowen theory. And I hope in the future, and she's talking in those terms, she may accept some responsibility at the Bowen Center, maybe starting a new community seminar, and become a member of our faculty. She's not a therapist, but she has worked in psychiatric settings part of her career. So that's sort of my attitude in approaching this interview, that I'm just interviewing a colleague, even though I've been helpful to her in dealing with things in her marriage. See, I want to make just one brief comment before opening it, or maybe a brief written comment. See what you all think about this in the mid-1940s, Bowen set out to develop a science of human behavior, which is kind of an arrogant thing to do, maybe. That this was possible, and his concern with Freud was that it included too much subjective stuff, in spite of all the important things that Freud contributed. I think one of the terms that rose out of that he gave new meaning to is emotional objectivity. And that it's not not possible to become completely emotionally objective. I don't know to what degree anybody can take it. But that's what I heard her effort as being. And I think what has happened, and any relationship for it to change, it's going to require someone to take the lead. People get so bogged down on we need to work together to change this, when ultimately somebody has to have the courage to step forward based on a new way of understanding it. Bowen used the metaphor of a team of horses. Always one horse steps, then the others follow. In vestibular worlds, people move back and forth on who takes the lead. It's not always dependent on one person. But this is the way I've come to understand emotional objectivity, and I think what systems thinking has done. Because you have this effort, again, to use the thinking system to deal with, to observe emotionality, the feeling as evident through the feeling state, and the assumption too in behaviors. If you can identify behaviors as really emotionally or anxiety driven, it's a way of trying to be objective about emotionality. And the other has the same task. Again, they're not each working at it equally. But what I hear in her description, that ability to realize no matter how hard she tries to self-regulate, she can't hold it, can't succeed, without realizing that the inputs she's getting from the environment are regulating her, as she said. And they're getting specific information about what those inputs are, verbal expression as well as nonverbal expression. But also, like equally important, the appreciation of what she's getting from the environment is also a product of what she is doing to the environment. And they are inseparable. And that's reciprocity. And this, maybe people have different thoughts on this, but I think that step by applying systems thinking, I mean, people have applied systems thinking to the human body basically for a long time, although understanding the mind-body connection on a systems basis is more recent, I think, because the knowledge base wasn't there. And it was only in the 50s, and Paul MacLean, I think, does get a lot of credit for this. He built on work of a man named Papez, P-A-P-E-Z, in the 30s. But by showing, identifying the nature of the emotional system in human beings, and then eventually a link established by how what was going on in the mind could actually translate to the body through signals through the hypothalamus, transmitted through the circulation and then set off the stress response in the body. It became possible to see and how the body then fed back, feedback loops. I think how the body is a system, including mind and the somatic components. And that was crucial, but there's something about being able to then extend it to see how much the individual is regulated by the environment, and in terms, and as I said earlier, how the individual is also changing the environment, creating the context, or the term I like, and I think Cacioppo used the term co-regulate. Barbara King, I got that term from Barbara King, a primatologist studying gorillas and how they interact, came up with co-create, which is the opposite of saying you're causing me to be this way, of course. We are co-creating, and I'll often go to the board and use that word, and people pay attention to it. But as she emphasized, it is terribly difficult to see it in your own life, terribly difficult to appreciate. But there's something in theory being the lens, as that quote I put at the end, quoted myself at the end yesterday. Having the lens, one piece of that lens, of course, is reciprocity. That's a conceptual framework for looking at behavior. But having that lens seems to be what then enables people to see this finally, if they work at it. But also, to link it up with the internal. So I think it moves emotional objectivity to a much more, this becomes a practical idea that people can actually gain this. And that moves us in this direction. I'll stop with that. We have about 35 minutes or so. I'd be interested in your comments and thoughts, as usual. To me, she's a gift. She'll be the first to say that, like everybody who makes a tape will say, I look better on the tape than I really do. Now, I think it's important to recognize, it's true for all of us, because people can pull up to a certain level. It's hard to hold it. But actually, this has held up pretty well. There's a calmness about her that's new. And I think there's a reduction of chronic anxiety in that relationship that's new. But it's not dramatic, and there's always more than that. Yes?
She made a comment in there about your teaching her theory, I believe. And of course, she has been exposed to this for quite a long time. But take, for an example, a new client who maybe knows nothing about Bowen theory and has been more used to traditional psychotherapy. Do you make a concerted effort to teach theory, maybe not using the terminology, but do you do some sort of teaching? In other words, for a person, for example, to understand that, like, as she was coming to grips with that her and her husband's behavior was, and struggling marriage was impacting the son, that whole organic concept, which is part of Bowen theory. Is that something that you will begin to teach the client, in essence, and other tenets of Bowen theory along the way?
Yeah, at some point in the early 70s, Dr. Bowen he was doing a lot of therapy then that had several couples, and he called it multiple family therapy. And spent maybe half hour with this couple, then a half hour with this couple, and a half hour with this couple, and they could listen. The other couples could listen while he was interacting with one. And he got so sort of, I think, impressed with the educational component of it that he wanted to change the name to multiple family training. He never did, but I thought it was a good point that this is, education, I think, is a huge part of what this is about. And, but how do you do it in a way that respects the emotional process that's at work? so that you make good contact with somebody at the same time, representing a way of thinking. The way I have, I'll say to people, because I'll get up in a session with people who've never been exposed to this, I'll go to the board. Of course, they have no idea. What's this guy got a blackboard here for? And he's up drawing all these things. In fact, one man, one time, said, Dr. Kerr, your diagrams, you know, they're helpful. And I can see when you draw these things. It said, you know, stop for a minute and consider from my position. To say how humbling it is to see your whole life reduced to squares and circles. And another man said that whenever my wife and I get into it now, I have an image of your blackboard in my head, and I look at that. So what I'll say to people, and I really believe this is the way I try to work with people, is that it's my job to listen to what they have to say about how they are thinking about this problem. And I'll say, I'll listen to you, and I'll form a hypothesis about what I think is going on based on my theoretical frame. And then I'll try to communicate that to you any way I can. And that always is going to involve an element of teaching. As soon as you get up and draw a diagram like this, you're teaching, right? And I routinely do that, particularly early on, but as Barbara Maher said, maybe not enough, although the setting was right. But then I'll say it's just a hypothesis. So I'm going to listen to how you're looking at it. I'm going to tell you how I'm looking at it. And then we exchange. And that's where I see the learning process, is a open exchange where they can modify the way I'm seeing it based on. But I think when you define yourself with people in a way that's neutral, it's not threatening, it's useful to them because they may not quite see it that way, and they come back with the way they see it. All the time, if you're seeing two people, you're always paying attention to the triangle, and you're not going to be perceived as on one side or the other. Always there's the attention paid to the emotional process. But most of the teaching involves that. But then people do have access. They can read things. Some people ask to read things. I don't push that. People come to conferences, take the community seminar. Most don't, but some do. So I would say education is at least half of it. The attention to the emotional process, which I think is really the key to the success of it. You've got to have a clean, working relationship with people where you're not caught in a triangle. You truly are neutral, and they see you that way. Yes?
One of the things that seems to me, in terms of a kind of prognosis of how things may go, is a client's ability to stop other focusing and focus on self. I've never had a great deal of success when people can make that transition. One of the things I was impressed by with the tape was that early on she seemed to be focusing a great deal on her husband. I couldn't find anything that would work. Sounded to me, perhaps incorrectly, as though she was looking to him to change. And she kept talking about, I didn't know what to do, and my failure, more individualistic. But at the end, she seemed to be more into the self-focus. I think that's a tremendously important shift. And her ability to do that based on that book, I think probably was extremely important to her. Anyway, I was impressed with that shift that seemed to me. Clients will often, my clients, after a few sessions will come in and say, well, it isn't working. And I've grown to know what they mean by that. They mean my spouse isn't changing. And as long as I maintain that focus, I think it's very difficult for them to make any headway.
Well, I think, I hear your point, I think it's a valid one. My impression is all the self-help books say you can't change others, you can only change yourself. Don't be focusing on others, you gotta focus on yourself. People know this. And I thought what was key for her is a better understanding of why she couldn't do it. Because I think when you really see how you're functioning, when you don't see, well, wait a minute, if your viewpoint is how you are as a person, how you're feeling and how you're acting is dependent on the way the other is treating you or relating to you or your perception of it, it is terribly easy to slip into trying to get them to be different, right? And without even appreciating that that's a problem. And it's almost as if I must do this. I am so upset and miserable. I see no alternative to try, other than to try to get the other to quit doing this to me and to be more the way I need it to be. And where the brain is just literally taken over with the feeling state. So what's, as I'm sure you know from what you watched, what was missing is an understanding of why she couldn't do it. It's one thing to say, this is what you need to do, every book says it. Why can't people do it? Because they don't understand it well enough and don't see the reciprocity. And I think in seeing that reciprocity for the first time in her long-term effort, it became possible to have confidence that by focusing on herself, this could change. Not only could she change, but this relationship could change. And I think that's the gift of poet theory. Because the spouses will tell each other this all the time, right? You got to quit focusing on me, or you're acting out your problem with your mother, with me. It doesn't help. Yes?
This is more of an observation, but you may have something to say about it. I found myself about halfway through there wanting to hear what he had to say, her husband. And I understand the whole reciprocity thing and her process and all that, but I really would like a 45-minute interview with him too.
Yeah, I did make one tape, and that's a good point. As I said, by having them both in the room, I learned some things about her that I hadn't seen before. And I do have one tape with him that it's back in, she referenced it, when things seem to be in the therapy aimed at getting the togetherness more in harmony. He seemed to like it, and truly he did, and he was willing to do this tape. But what I learned about him, and whether he would describe this about himself, is how much he saw himself as a prisoner of her upset and intensity and reactivity. And I think his basic message was, as long as you act this way, I am helpless to be different than I am. And you keep focusing on me, but you're not taking care of your part. It sounds sort of rational, except that his posture was one of helplessness. He truly meant, I cannot be with this woman and not react to her when she gets this intense. She, on the other hand, was having the same problem, but eventually got on top of it a little bit better. I think if he was on tape today, he would probably say, she says it's better. It's not that much better. Very, very sort of has that kind of bite to it. And so anyway, I agree with you. It would be great to hear it from his point of view. Yes?
Dr. Kerr, I think I captured this correctly, that you made a comment, and I've actually heard this several times during the conference, so I wanted to ask some clarification on it, is the importance of having a neutral stance in a relationship with somebody as you're trying to consult with them and not taking sides. But at the same time, it's important to make emotional contact with them. And so I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about what that looks like and what that means.
I'll try. Sometime in, I think this is probably the mid-1980s, maybe earlier, it doesn't make much difference, of course, but Phil Guerin was a family therapist in New York City area and spent a couple of years at Washington in training and got very interested in Bowen and started his own center up in New Rochelle, Westchester County. And he did a videotape of an interview with a family. And I think it was a couple. And he showed it, I forget where we were. Murray Bowen made the comment, it's fabulous. Phil is making solid emotional contact with every family member. And I thought, now what the hell does that mean? And it did come up yesterday. What does it mean? I don't know that I have a good explanation for that. I think the neutrality implies an understanding of the human condition, a tolerance of the human condition, respect for the power of emotionality. The person, well, like I mentioned yesterday, where the mother said, when I gave that example of my own family, she said, you understand what we're going through. To me, that's emotional contact. It's more than just intellectual. It's a sense of being in good connection with another human being, and that's not just an intellectual process. I think maybe that comes as close to it. And what interferes with it, is either getting overly sympathetic or overly distant. It's probably new people learning Bowen theory, probably the most common error is trying to act like you're out of it when you're really not, and it can be a turnoff. And it's the essence of differentiation. How do you be present and accounted for and sort of with somebody and still separate and distinct as an individual? I mean, as Bowen liked to say, people say, well, isn't there such a thing as too much differentiation? What about the togetherness? His typical response is you don't have to worry about the togetherness. It's always going to be there. And if you look at nature, who's going to modify 4 billion years of evolution with a little puny effort toward differentiation? And togetherness is so bearable. So I don't know how well that's what I mean by emotional contact. It's sort of, I think people can get better and better at this, but for sure what louses it up is getting anxious and threatened and all that, instead of being just present and accounted for and confident in who you are and able to listen to the other.
Well, I appreciate that. Going into a little bit more detail around it, I just want to make a final comment, and that is, I think as a therapist prior to Bowen theory, I think that my belief about what emotional contact was being on their side and feeling like they had an ally in terms of going through this. And as I worked very hard as a consultant to really work from a Bowen theory perspective, I think that I have gone to the other side of that and have sensed over the past year that at times I think sometimes my clients have not felt connected to me as I've tried to stay neutral, but there sometimes has not been that bond. So it is something it's really interesting to think about and to figure out what does that look like and for different people in different relationships. So thank you.
I thought, Jack Butler yesterday, was talking about Bowen's making that transition in NIMH, which was huge when you consider where the therapy world was when he began his effort. He was very much part of that, to actually think that you could be useful to somebody without becoming their ally, their advocate, what have you. One time I was at a meeting somewhere and I showed up tape of a young woman who was, you know, a fair amount of distress and about things in her life, but articulate in her expression of it. And through the tape, and this goes back maybe 20 years, and I hear less of this now than I used to. But the person said, Dr. Kerr, you seem to pay no attention to that woman's feelings. She was hurting, and you didn't seem to acknowledge it, comment on it, or deal with it. How can you call this therapy? So, and it wasn't an unusual comment in the early days particularly. But, so I when I went back to Washington, and I said to this person, I showed the tape you and I made, and this was one person's response. She says, oh my God, I don't need another human being in my life who feels what I feel. She said, what I need is objectivity. And I think that's true. People, when they sense that you are in fact being objective about their lives, but interested, it's a gift. It's like a breath of fresh air. And that's contact.
I really enjoyed this presentation. I'm going to go buy this book because I want to find out if horses smile or tell jokes. When I was watching this, I was pretty struck by, she did have a pretty dead face. And, you know, I could ask you how many jokes she told you and how many times could she laugh at herself in 3 years. For myself, what I find when I get really serious about something with my wife, I try to step back and try to laugh or tell a joke, or I'm not as relaxed. And I think that's one of the most important things. You know, when I observe, that's a long interview, and I saw maybe one time that she smiled. And that's important to me as an observer. You know, when I talk to patients diagnosed with cancer, they're very, very serious. And it's difficult to get a person so that they're not so serious. I think the functioning goes up. At least for me, it seems to, if I can't always do it. But I just wonder what you think about humor. And, you know, if you know if horses laugh or tell jokes, what does it say in the book?
Well, I know a number of the higher primates, chimps, exhibit laughter. And there's a thing on YouTube, if you put in Yak-Pank-Set or put in rats laughter. This will come up. And Yak won't believe. What he does is tickle rats. and shows the rats become addicted. They love it. And the way he demonstrated it is that he did it with audio recordings and showed that the sounds they were emitting when he was doing this tickle thing, and they were getting addicted, were distinctly different than other sounds they made. And he called it rat laughter, I believe, in essence. And so if he stopped doing it, moved down here, the rat would just come after me, wanting more and more and more. No doubt, all kinds of dopamine is being dumped out, endorphins, you name it, the oxytocin that make people feel good. Paul MacLean, when he defined the 3 innovations in the evolution of the mammals, it was nursing in conjunction with maternal care, the development of the isolation call in the offspring to alert the mother to distress. The 3 was play behavior. And I remember he was presenting one time, and I was involved in a meeting with him. And people said, well, how do we get people to play? As if that could solve the problem. And I agree that the people who are capable of seeing the humorous side of a difficult situation, if the therapist gets sucked in there with them, you don't see it in the person. If the therapist can get outside of it, then this can bring it out of the person, and think you're describing now. I think it's very useful. But some people in this world, and I don't think it's genetic, it's just deep programming, are more serious than others and have a hard time getting outside. If you want to go drinking with somebody, you'd go with her husband. He's got a terrific sense of humor. Loves to laugh, friendly and joking. And it's a great guy to be around. She's very serious. It's true. But would I set out to make her less serious? No, my goal would be to try to help her understand what killed her face. How did this happen? Without the assumption that she's going to become some great humorous person, but that she'll be looser and more able to see the humorous side. And anyway, so play, because I think, well, Panksepp did an experiment. Had these rats. The rats are nice. Doesn't make much difference. To them it does, I guess. Let's say it was mice in a cage. And they all had gotten to know each other. And they did a lot of rough and tumble play. And the mice do a lot of this, and the rats do a lot of this. So then he puts in a ball of cat hair into the cage. And they start smelling this thing. And all play stops. Dead serious. And so they're all feeling threatened. Is, I think, a logical assumption. Takes these mice out of that cage, puts them somewhere else, cleans up this cage, whatever you got to do to get rid of that smell, puts them back in the cage. It takes them about 24 hours to be certain everything's okay. Then the rough and tumble play resumes. But I thought it was a nice demonstration of the interplay between stress level. Because, of course, some people, when they're stressed, they come out with anxious humor. I grew up doing that. When the family was uptight, I'd come out with the jokester stuff. But it was all pretty reactive, as I would see it. Later, when I better understood that, I think I actually had a better sense of humor. Because it wasn't based on so much on reactivity. Because when it's not based on reactivity, as you say, nothing can cut through an uptight situation better than a well-placed humorous comment or what have you. Dogs are interesting because they have what I think dog owners call smiles. You probably know this. They bare their teeth. But actually, it's a sort of supplication of wanting affection. It's not a threat at all, but when you first see it, it looks like the dog's baring his teeth at you. And they call it smiles. Anyway. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
When you were setting up the clip, I was kind of curious about a couple of things you said that kind of caught my ear. And one of them, you were emphasizing how you were talking about I interview her as a colleague and kind of the beginnings of that. And then later when I was listening to her and the colt and the mare story and how she realized that she was the colt so often with her husband. And then I was wondering if you saw not just with this case but with your other cases the importance of you seeing her as a colleague in this one, and that we're all colleagues of each other, and we're all colts and mares at different times. If you saw a shift in your relationship that you needed to do, it was very important because she was able to be the colleague, perhaps. It was very, very hard for her to come to her husband because this was her place of where I had little success, my failure, my embarrassment, where she a couple of times. Do you see that as an important piece of your stance?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's not just her, is it? The way I would see it, I think most therapists, and certainly I was in that group when you started out, you're kind of anxious about doing your job well. And there's a protectiveness in this therapist-patient-client relationship and all that. But we are fellow travelers. We're all the human families, they differ in degree but not kind. I had one couple say to me, particularly the wife, she said, you know, when you point out my immaturity, she said, I don't feel put down. And I was very pleased to hear that. And to me, that is a goal. How do you discuss immaturity in others without the other feeling put down or criticized for it? And I think that really does depend on the therapist's attitude about it and getting a good, solid grip of the therapist on his or her own immaturity and a real tolerance and understanding of the human condition and the way it works. And it does make it, I think, a collegial relationship. I have a certain expertise, but they have a certain expertise, and it's a level playing field.
But you see that kind of shifting with different people. That for her, for example, that perhaps she needed to be your kind of star student and to be the failure to show her that really was the hard part. She could sustain for many years with you and would avoid it very, very strongly, except for when her son was in peril and she didn't do it. She avoided it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I think absolutely, I hadn't really thought about that, but just the whole stepping forward and said, I am going to do this, was a defining of self and a change in her relationship with me. That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. Thanks.
It's interesting, this is not the first time that I've seen this tape, but I had it's so nice to be able to think about it again, and here gave me a question that I don't think I've ever spelled out before. And this is, the very common understanding that's available to people, and it's so helpful, about what are the responses of the system to differentiating moves. And for people to know that and deal with that the system is likely to have a response that's going to be difficult to deal with, but you can prepare yourself. But I had a question, listening to this last effort of hers, differentiating a face among them, that my sense was, and you may know more now, that this probably basic change would not be the same kind of change that would jar the system. That there was something different about it. Do you have any sense of that in terms of the change back?
No, I hear your point. I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but I think I hear your point very loud and clear. Because again, it would be interesting to ask the husband. I mean, because it's not really what he wants it to be. Because what he wants it to be is what he's been trying for years to make happen. This kind of comfortable togetherness. But begrudgingly, he'll admit things are calmer in the family. We don't have these big upheavals and all that. And I think that does match. That she came to a level of calmness and neutrality where she recognized what's the difference between accepting the other for who they are and just sort of giving in and say, oh, that's my burden in life to carry. And I think theory can make that possible, where you can accept the other for who they are, but you're not approving or disapproving of the other either. You're just seeing the other for who they are. You're more accepting, but you're not in favor and you're not against. And it puts the other, I think, in a much better position for at least considering what they might want to change about themselves. But yeah, it doesn't get anywhere near the kind of reaction you get when you define a self in a different kind of set of circumstances and the other really comes after you. I just think maybe it's on a continuum, I don't know, because I think both can represent very solid differentiation. I know that when my wife, the clearest example I have is when this son of ours started to puddle big time. And over time, my wife figured out that, yes, this was a pretty intense fusion. I had been critical of that for years. Big help. Sympathetic with him, basically. And figured out two fundamental things. One, she's on his back too much. And two, she gives in to him too much, treats him like a prince. And he's entitled. And that was very calming for her to get clear about that. So she starts to both get off his back and have more expectations for responsible behavior. Won't get into all the details. Gets a big backlash here from him. And then comes an appeal to me, and to which I was vulnerable. And so, and not appreciating at that point that the more I respond to that appeal at him in subtle and not so subtle ways, I totally undercut her ability to be a self. What position does she take? Well, if you two guys want to be together, that's okay by me. And she meant it. And boy, did I try to explain to her, this is no way to do business with both of you. And I really came at her as director of the Bowen Center. I'm serious, and I was emotional. It didn't, I think if it had happened 10 years earlier, it would have gone on longer. Because in the back of my mind, I knew that this was defining a self. And I was coming back with a very strong reaction. You're wrong. This is not the right way to go about it. Change back. She was cool as a cucumber. And she was ready to move out. She'd already called a friend and said, could I stay with you for a while? These two characters seemed to be one of, the friend was pretty upset about it. So it's humbling to admit that it took that. But then I realized, of course, and had a much better understanding of triangles after that. And how much the role of the father could totally undercut the effectiveness of the mother. I began to see it that way and truly believe what Owen wrote about in the 1960s. If you can leave the process between two others, they will find a way. She's got to have, in this case, the room to do it, but he has to have an understanding that I'm not going to step in the middle of it. And well, when I didn't, I got a big attack from him, which is in essence, now you're taking her side. But I knew that wasn't him. Anyway, it was a long answer to a short question, but I think that's a good point to raise, because there wasn't a big explosion here. It was just a kind of a quieter calming. But it's not all. Do you want to say any more, or does that speak to?
I'll think about it.
Okay, I'd be interested in hearing your ideas. Want to take it right now?
I will hold on to my comments for later in the day, and thank you for a great morning.
Okay.